Good afternoon and welcome to Oregon Center for Public Policy's webinar on the Oregon Kids Credit. My name is Alejandro Queral. I am the Executive Director of OCPP and I'm joined by my colleague, Tyler McInnes. A couple of other colleagues have also joined. So let me just start by, first of all, thanking all of you for being here. This is an exciting moment for OCPP, and really this work is not possible without your support, whether you've provided financial support to the organization, or you are a supporter in spirit, or if you've used our publications for your work, or have engaged interaction alerts. Any of that is considered support in my mind, and I thank you for that. We really couldn't do the work that we do without you. This is, as you know, Oregon Center for Public Policy is a not-for-profit, nonpartisan organization whose mission is to achieve economic justice for all Oregonians using our research, policy analysis, and advocacy. And in service to this effort, to this mission, over the past year and a half or so, we have been working very hard to align our tax and budget policy work with the priorities that communities have identified as necessary for addressing the economic challenges they face. And we really approach this work anchored on our belief that communities are more likely to have the best solutions to the challenges they face. They certainly understand what the problems they face, and we believe that they also are and need to be participants in developing their own solutions. And part of our work as a research think tank is to translate those solutions into policy options that can help change the structures and rules that govern our economy. So we embarked in a year-long process of research and deep conversations with our community partners to understand what would be the policies that help advance economic justice in Oregon. And all of this input was paired with our research and analysis, particularly our data analysis, so that we could better understand how and why Oregonians are struggling to make ends meet. Obviously the big picture is, first of all, that low-income Oregonians have continued to face barriers to economic stability. And this is clearly a product of the system that we've created. And it's a system that has also led to continued increases or continued worsening of economic inequality throughout the state. We've published a number of reports on this issue, and probably the starkest example of this is a report we published not long ago, where we identify, why and how this economic stability, what are the drivers of this economic inequality, and all the reasons why we have a situation we currently have. The result at the end of the day of this year-long conversations and data analysis was the development of an ambitious plan to build economic justice in Oregon. We're calling this the Action Plan for the People, which was released in May of 2022, and you can find it on through our website, ocpp.org, or at actionplanoregon.com, and you have the link there. This action plan addresses the pressing needs identified by these community partners and proposes policy change in three broad areas. And again, you can look at the details. I won't go into the details today, but the three broad areas are policies, first of all, policies that lead to economic stability for Oregon families by boosting their income. And this is an area that Tyler will talk about in a minute. Secondly, we have policies that strengthen workers' ability to demand better pay, better working conditions, and to ensure that their rights as workers are being protected. And third, policies that make our tax code more progressive, adequate, and equitable. And we'd be happy to talk more about this, but I'm sure we will be talking about this action plan for years to come, because part of our effort here involves some long-term structural changes that will require a lot of work over the years, hopefully less than years, but the reality is some of these are significant challenges. In addition to the action plan that really provides a guidance for us, we've developed a number of tools, one of which we're showing you here, in which we're calling Data for the People. That can be found on our website, ocpp.org/ well, I'm not going to read it. You can see it right there. But go to our website. It's on the landing page. And you can explore it. It's a tool worth exploring. We have a number of economic indicators that we've identified or that we have been tracking for a number of years. This is, in a sense, a new iteration for those of you who have been following our work over the years. This is a new iteration and a new approach to our State of Working Oregon series. And there's a lot more data to explore there. It's quite interactive, so please go check that out. The Data for the People, again, is a resource that contains the essential data on the economic status of Oregonians, and we're using this cutting-edge analysis of using racial and ethnic data, using new methodologies for understanding racial and ethnic data and disaggregating it, and to present it in a way where all communities see themselves in that data. So it not only incorporates and disaggregates data more significantly, but it actually anchors some of the economic data on markers that I think better reflect the people's experience in their own communities. This tool has been developed the same as the action plan in close collaboration with community partners, some of which are presented on this slide. I want to particularly give a shout out to the Coalition of Communities of Color, who have been an integral partner in this process, both in terms of advising a methodological approach, as well as supporting our efforts with their own set of members. So thank you to the Coalition and to the other groups reflected here. One of the issues that has arisen during this conversation and this analysis is the fact that a significant share of Oregonians of color continue to fall below a survival threshold budget. The survival threshold budget, we've calculated using a methodology that was developed by the United Way called ALICE, which is an acronym that stands for Asset Limited Income Constrained Employee. And what it does is it creates a survival threshold for different combinations of family structures, in different parts in different states, essentially. And what we have here, we've also disaggregated the data significantly so that, the racial and ethnic groups that you see here are much more granular in terms of how we are understanding the data. And what you can see here, and again, when you go to the website, you can actually flip your cursor over any of these columns and you can see the actual share within a group that is falling below the ALICE survival threshold. Right. And so if you look at, for example, the Ethiopian community, the third column on your left there, about 79% of the Ethiopian community in Oregon is falling below the ALICE survival threshold. What this indicates to us is that there is a great need in our state for implementing policies that ultimately will provide economic stability. And through our conversations, we identify policies that specifically provide cash to people. As a policy solution that would address at least some elements of these concerns. And so this is what we're going to talk about today. We have identified specific policy that we will be working on through this legislative session in 2023. But Tyler will also hint at, and if you look at our action plan, you can see where our conversation around putting cash in Oregonians' pockets will be going in future years and in future legislative sessions. But today, mostly we will be focusing on the Oregon Kids Credit. So I'm going to turn it over to Tyler to tell you more about this work.
All right, thanks, Alejandro. And thank you everyone for joining this afternoon. It's nice to see some familiar names in the chat. As Alejandro mentioned, my name is Tyler McInnes. I'm a policy analyst here at the center. And I'm really excited to share more about the Oregon Kids Credit here today. I want to first start by talking a little bit about how we arrived at prioritizing this campaign. And as Alejandro mentioned, in the development of our action plan with partners, time and time again, we are hearing the need for more policies to get flexible cash resources into the hands of families who are struggling to make ends meet. We know, we've learned that people know what their families need most, and too often our social safety net programs are underfunded, inaccessible, or have racist and patriarchal rules that prevent people from getting the help that they need and deserve. So that's why if you take a look at the income section of our action plan, we're really prioritizing a long-term campaign to establish a guaranteed income here in Oregon. But we know that that's an effort that's going to take some time, as Alejandro alluded to. And as we've seen in the data, there are many, many Oregon families who are struggling today. So we need to be looking for ways in this upcoming legislative session to raise people's incomes. One of the silver linings we saw in the responses to the pandemic in recent years is that lawmakers at all levels of government were much more willing, understandably given the urgency of the situation we were facing, to prioritize policies giving unrestricted cash to people. We saw this all over the country, whether it was the federal stimulus payments, the creation here in Oregon of the Oregon Worker Relief Fund, which provided payments similar to unemployment insurance for undocumented workers. $600 payments went out the door at the end of last legislative session to anyone who had claimed the Oregon Earned Income Tax Credit the previous year. And we now have more than 100 guaranteed income pilot projects operational across the country, mostly being implemented at the municipal or city level. But perhaps most notably, we saw the success of unrestricted cash policies with the temporarily expanded federal child tax credit. So a bit of background on that expansion. The federal child tax credit was temporarily expanded in 2021 as part of the American Rescue Plan. And now that we're like a couple years removed from 2021, we have some data to be able to look back and evaluate the impact of what that expansion did. And what we've learned is that it's proven to be one of the more significant and successful anti-poverty policies in recent memory. And what it did was pretty simple. The child tax credit expansion made the credit fully refundable and larger overall, particularly so for families with young children. It made the credit more available to families with little or no income. And it delivered the credit in advanced monthly payments so that families would be able to receive a portion of their federal CTC upfront, rather than having to wait until tax filing season. And as I mentioned, we have data now to be able to look back and look at what the impacts of that expansion, what those impacts were. And what we've learned is they were really, really significant. The US Census Bureau estimated that child poverty dropped a record-breaking 46% year over year from 2020 to 2021. And that was largely driven by the impacts of the expanded CTC and other stimulus policies. The official child poverty rate in 2021 was the lowest on record in the census numbers. That 5.2% you see on the screen there is the lowest that we've seen in the census data. And that's remarkable when you think back to how precarious the economy was in 2021 for so many families, and still is. Our partners at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities have estimated that without the expanded CTC, child poverty would have been 8.1% in 2021. That's the chart you're seeing here. But instead it dropped to 5.2%, which again is that lowest figure on record that we've seen in the data. We've also seen a narrowing of the gap in poverty rates experienced by children of color and their white peers nationwide by the impacts of that expanded CTC. And while that's good progress, you can see in this chart, we still have a long, long ways to go. And so we need to be looking for how to replicate the success of these kinds of policies, both at the federal level, but here in Oregon, more importantly, to really be able to close these gaps permanently. And we've learned that giving families flexible cash resources is a really efficient and significant way to address these disparities. Ultimately, it's not rocket science and perhaps not breaking news to folks who are on this webinar, but a good policy response to families who don't have enough resources to get by is to give those families money. And we also know from some of the census data that was collected during this time in 2021, how families were spending those dollars. The census implemented this thing called the Pulse Survey that was kind of tracking in real time what the various responses the federal government was doing in response to the COVID pandemic, how people were impacted by those policy responses. Unsurprisingly, the most common ways in which people reported spending their child tax credit dollars in 2021 were on necessities, things like shelter, food, clothing for their kids. And in fact, when we dig deeper and just look at Oregon and look at low-income families surveyed here in Oregon, we find that nearly 9 in every 10 low-income families surveyed in Oregon reported spending their expanded child tax credit dollars on some kind of basic needs. Again, things like paying the rent, their mortgage, keeping food on the table, clothes for their kids. So we know that this policy is ultimately really about ensuring families have those resources needed to be more economically stable and provide their family with the basic necessities that they deserve. So I've mentioned that the CTC expansion was temporary, and unfortunately it remains so. The expanded version of the CTC expired last year. Our team worked really hard last month with several of our partner organizations. Some of you may be in the room here today, to push Congress to re-expand the expanded CTC and make those expansions permanent at the end of December. But despite our Senate delegation really championing and fighting for those changes, Congress as a whole failed to act. So we are back to the weaker, earlier version of the child tax credit. As a result, an estimated 3.7 million children fell back into poverty, and 192,000 Oregon children lost access to the credit. That 3.7 million children figure, a nationwide figure. But 192,000 Oregon children losing access to the credit overall. So we've seen significant impacts as a result of reverting back to the weaker form of the CTC. So we know that Oregon can't wait. We can't wait on Congress to act. We need to act now. And that is why we're prioritizing the creation of a state child tax credit, which we're calling the Oregon Kids Credit, this upcoming legislative session. So let's talk about the Oregon Kids Credit. We're really excited about this concept, and we've been really, really encouraged to see so many partner organizations come together and lawmakers come together around this concept. To date, we have a growing list of more than 20 organizations who've signed on to endorse this policy. We're also extremely grateful to have the support of Representatives Valderrama, Reynolds, Graber, Confam, and Senators Dembro and Jama already signed on to the bill. And this policy is being designed to really take some of the most critical lessons from the expanded child tax credit and put them to work here in Oregon. So the Oregon Kids Credit would be a fully refundable child tax credit, and that refundability piece is really key. So I'll take a moment to just explain what that is. That means that after applying this tax credit against any taxes a family might owe to the state of Oregon, any additional amount is returned to them in the form of a tax refund. So that's the piece that gets cash into the hands of families who are struggling with the high costs of raising children. So that fully refundable tax credit piece is really key. As currently designed, the policy would be $1,200 for each dependent child aged 17 or younger on a state income tax return. The full credit would be available to families earning from $0 of earned income up to $40,000 in adjusted gross income. And then we begin to gradually phase out eligibility and completely phase out by about $45,000. I want to take a moment here to note that this is a key difference from the federal credit, and intentionally so. We're making it fully available to families with little or no incomes. That's a lesson that we learned in the expanded federal credit that had significant impacts. And so we want to replicate that here in Oregon. And we know at the state level too, we need to balance our budgets at the end of the day. And so this is also an attempt to really maximize our investment by steering the bulk of the resources we're putting into the Oregon Kids Credit towards the families in greatest need. Another key distinction from the federal credit is that the Oregon Kids Credit would be available to any family who files income taxes in the state of Oregon. So oftentimes families who have mixed immigration statuses in the household will file using what's called an individual taxpayer identification number, or ITIN, you might hear it referred to. They use that instead of a social security number. Under the Oregon Kids Credit, if you're a child whose family meets the income criteria, you're eligible for the credit regardless of whatever number your parent uses to file your taxes. So that's something we want to be really certain about, is that we're as inclusive as possible in terms of how this policy is designed. So let's take a look at an example family. Let's assume that this hypothetical family has 2 parents and 3 children. One parent is working for low wages and getting inconsistent hours at work. The other is staying home to provide childcare for their 3 kids. Together, they earn about $20,000, meaning that they're experiencing poverty. But it also means that the family would be eligible for the Oregon Kids Credit. And since each of their 3 children qualifies, they would receive a $3,600 refundable tax credit when they go to file their Oregon state income taxes. That $3,600 equates to an 18% increase in their annual household income. That's really significant. It's likely amounts to several months of rent they might be able to pay, some added security knowing that they'd be better positioned to put food on the table. Maybe it helps them pay down some debt. or perhaps it even just allows them to take their family out for a dinner or a movie night. Too often families who are living in poverty are robbed of those small moments in life that provide a sense of dignity and some added room to breathe. And ultimately, that's what we're trying to accomplish with the Oregon Kids Credit, is to give families that added room to breathe, to give them the additional resources that they need to be more economically stable and to reduce child poverty. Again, we've learned from recent experience that unrestricted, unconditional cash policies can be really, really effective in improving economic security and reducing poverty. And we also know that every Oregon child deserves to grow up in a home that's financially secure. And we think the Oregon Kids Credit is one of the best ways that we can move towards that vision in this upcoming legislative session. So there's a link here. If you want to be more involved in the campaign, please feel free. It links to a Google form. You can get involved in that way. And with that, I will pause and probably turn it back over to you, Alejandro, for any questions that we might be getting from the audience.
Thanks, Tyler. Great overview, and I hope that we get more questions from folks. If you want to dig in a little bit more into the details, just to pick up where Tyler left off in terms of the joining the campaign, there's certainly opportunities for you to get involved, and there's other ways that you can keep track of this work. If you go to ocpp.org, you can sign up for our distribution list, where we will share with you any publications on this topic or any of the other work that we're spending our time on, as well as opportunities for getting involved more directly during the legislative sessions, including but not limited to action alerts, which are actually very important in our efforts. Tyler, I think one of the first questions is, if you could talk a little bit about how you see this legislation moving forward during the session. What does that path look like? And perhaps talk about some of the barriers and opportunities you foresee.
Yeah, so I mean, the exact path remains to be seen. We're waiting for bills to be referred to their respective committees. So we'll learn more in the coming weeks and have a stronger sense of where things will likely go. But this is a tax expenditure that we're talking about at the end of the day, and the legislature typically has an omnibus package of combination of both expiring and new tax expenditures that typically moves towards the end of session. And so we think the most likely path is for this concept, the Oregon Kids Credit, to end up as part of that end of year tax omnibus bill. And so, I think one of the tasks ahead of us as a coalition and as a campaign is to really make sure that the Joint Committee on Taxation has the budget that they need to work with to ensure that the Oregon Kids Credit is included in that omnibus package. But that's the most likely path we see it taking. It'll start most likely from the House side and work its way towards the Joint Committee on Taxation.
Great, thank you. Thanks, that's helpful. One of our attendees is also asking, Lori Trigger from Eugene is asking, what if any other states what other states have such initiative in the works? And I think what she's asking is, are there other efforts afoot, or are there other states that have implemented a child tax credit?
Yeah, that's a great question, Lori. I mean, I actually, just before jumping on this webinar, hopped off a call with some of our partners in other states who are working on similar campaigns this upcoming legislative session. So there were folks from New York who were advancing a child tax credit this session. I believe Illinois was on the call. Vermont was just successful in passing a child tax credit last year. We've seen, I believe the Republican governor in Montana is proposing a child tax credit, not too dissimilar from what we've described here. So that's the other, this is something that I think people broadly see the success of in recent years. And because the expanded version of the CTC has expired at the federal level, we're seeing a lot of states look to create child tax credits where they didn't exist before as a means of kind of filling that gap. And so I've mentioned a handful of states that are looking at creating child tax credits this upcoming legislative session. But there are many, many more who worked to pass some last year, and there are more who are working on this upcoming year that are slipping my mind currently. But Oregon is certainly not alone in this effort. We're seeing this is kind of like almost like a best practice approach that state organizations are taking to advance better policies in their communities.
Thanks, Tyler. Appreciate it. And Lori comments excitedly about Montana, which it's a whole different conversation. So I think the motivations in different states are different for why they're advancing this policy. Caitlin is asking whether we have a sense of how many families would potentially be eligible for this credit.
We're still working to model that and estimate that, and we're planning to have better estimates on that in the coming weeks here, based on some preliminary estimates that we've been working on the Legislative Revenue Office on developing. Probably about the bottom third of Oregon children, I would say, roughly. You know, if you were to spread out Oregon children by income, so you know, a pretty significant chunk of Oregon kids would fall under the Oregon Kids credit. And again, because of the way we're structuring this, we're really trying to drive every dollar that we're putting into the Oregon Kids credit towards those kids in greatest need. So we think it's a really effective and efficient way of getting additional resources to those children, and a significant number of them.
So more to come on that front. I want to thank Candace Jimenez. She's pointing out that in order to access the bit.ly link in the portion of Oregon Kids credit must be lowercase, otherwise it doesn't work if it's uppercase as it's in this slide. So thank you for noticing that. Appreciate that. Randolph is asking or suggesting that in order to appeal to more conservative legislators, can we point to studies like, for example, the Columbia University Center on Poverty and Social Policy, studies that show that a child tax credit such as this would reap 8 times the cost in social benefits? In other words, it would do more than pay for itself. You want to comment on that, Tyler?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of those things where there's so much research, especially at the federal level at this point, on all the sorts of positive impacts that the child tax credit at the federal level has had over the years. So there's, you know, you name it, like we can point to those sorts of return on investments. We can talk about the positive health outcomes that there was just a study that came out, I think the other day or recently, about all the mental health, the positive mental health impacts that folks experienced who received the expanded child tax credit in 2021. And again, we've seen those reductions in poverty and all sorts of other benefits. So there's all sorts of research to back up the fact that this is a good policy for Oregon and for communities across the country. I'll also note that as we were looking through some of the bills that were introduced earlier this week, as bills dropped, we had the Senator Hayden, Republican Senator Hayden here in Oregon, has also introduced a child tax credit concept, not too dissimilar from the Oregon Kids credit, as I've described here. And so I think ultimately this is one of those examples of kind of just a common sense, good policy that folks, regardless of their political orientations, can get behind. It's a good use of state dollars, investing in an efficient way to ensure that families are more economically secure.
That's great. And you know, one detail that may be worth sharing that Kathleen Joy raises, whether the bill has been introduced and what number sponsors, which Tyler, you want to tell us the number and sort of the caveats with the bill as introduced?
Yeah, sure. So the Oregon Kids credit is House Bill 2811. The caveat there is the bill as drafted will need to be amended to better reflect the policy design as I've described here. So that's going to be a first order of business once the bill comes before whichever policy committee it's referred to, is to amend the bill so that it's in alignment with the policy design as I've described here. We worked to get the bill introduced, and as it was drafted by Legislative Council, it's tied more directly to the federal credit. But as we had more conversations with partners, we decided that disconnecting from the federal credit so that we could, as I mentioned, steer resources towards families with little to no income, include ITIN filers, made more sense for what we were trying to accomplish here in Oregon. So the policy design has changed a bit since we asked Legislative Council to draft that bill. So 2811 is the bill number, but don't be surprised when you go to take a look at it that it looks a little different right now than what I've described here. We will be working to amend that bill as first order of business to bring it into alignment with this vision here.
Thanks, Tyler. One other piece, or more connected to sort of the benefits, is this question around the federal child tax credit, and much of the analysis that's been done assumes that there's the distribution of those dollars is through using recurring payments. Can you talk a little bit about how the Oregon Kids Credit would be distributed, and what sort of implications that has?
Meaning like the frequency of payments, like the
Right.
annual versus monthly
Yep.
piece? Yeah, so we learned during the expanded federal child tax credit that monthly piece is really beneficial to families in terms of meeting their monthly household cash flow obligations. Unfortunately, states are currently barred, might be a too strong a word, but there's a lack of clarity in federal rules as to what would happen if states were to start distributing tax credits like this on a monthly basis. What we think would likely happen is that those tax credits would begin to count as income when folks are being considered for other public benefits. So it could negatively impact a family qualifying for SNAP or food assistance, for instance. It could affect their eligibility for a housing voucher. So we want to be really careful that if we move towards monthly payments, that we're not negatively impacting families in that way. We want that to be a net positive for them. So the Oregon Kids Credit, as conceptualized here, would be an annual refundable tax credit. And those annual lump sum payments are still really, really effective in terms of helping families meet all sorts of costs that are weighing down on them, particularly things like paying off debt or, covering rent for a month or two. Like those lump sum payments are really, really critical, and people count on them at tax time. But we do want to move towards delivering those on a monthly basis if we can. And so one of the things we are working on with some of our national partners is to see if we can get those federal rules changed. And we were hoping that we might be able to sneak that in as part of the end of year omnibus package in December at the federal level. And due to the dysfunction in Congress, so to speak, that unfortunately was not included in their end of year work. So that's an ongoing task for us at the federal level, but it is something that we're really, really interested in doing more of in the future, because that is really one of the ways in which we can make these kinds of policies a lot more effective for families in terms of meeting their month-to-month expense obligations, whether it's utility bills, keeping food on the table, those sorts of things. So the kids credit will be annual for now, but we definitely want to look at how we can get Oregon towards a more regular payment process in the future.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful. Candace Jimenez is asking how OCPP will work through this campaign, and whether we're going to continue to work with community partners so that we continue to engage with those families who might be in need to access a resource like this, or who may be impacted by this policy in the state. Can you talk a little bit about how you foresee continued engagement with community members through our relationships with community partners? And I can also help fill in some of the blanks.
Yeah, I can give it a shot, and feel free to jump in too with any other thoughts. I mentioned we have more than 20 organizations who have signed on to this campaign thus far, and the bulk of those are organizations that have much deeper ties with the community than we do as a policy think tank. So we're really going to be, relying on our partners and leveraging those relationships to find ways to make sure that, the folks in the community that they represent are aware of this campaign, are able to get involved in any capacity that they so choose, whether it's, testifying in Salem, sharing their experience or their story with us about how a policy like this might positively impact their families. So we're really going to be leaning on those partnerships to ensure that we're engaging community throughout this process and in that way. And we're really hoping that this is something we can move this session. And so, if we're successful, we'll also want to be following up with the partners that we've worked with on this campaign to make sure that, the members that they work with in the community, that they know that, the Oregon Kids Credit's now available to them and their families, and make sure that families are claiming the credit if they're eligible. Because that's the goal, right? We want to make sure that families who are struggling to get by are getting some additional help. And so, we're ready to work in whatever capacity we need to with our partners to ensure that that happens.
Yeah, I will only add that, I mean, this is, a collective effort. This is OCPP is leading on the policy development, but we couldn't do it without our partners and with its community input. Our structure is not set up. We're not a grassroots organization, so we'll rely on the existing structures and processes that our community partners have developed to engage with community members. Frankly, they know how to do it way better than us, and so we not only follow their lead, but really follow their advice. So their participation is really integral to the success of this campaign. I want to shift gears and remind folks that if you have questions, the Q&A feature is the way to do it. We have a couple more on the queue. Annie's, and I'm saying I'm going to have to interpret a little bit your question here, but she's noting that, part of the positive effects of a kids credit of this nature is increases in literacy. And so whether the question, I think, is getting at whether education partners are involved in this efforts, since it does get to an issue that they really are concerned about.
Yeah, we've had a number of, I would say, children's advocacy organizations who are among our partners in this work. This will be a part of the children's agenda. If folks are familiar with that agenda that Our Children Oregon puts out, we're really excited that it's going to be not just included, but a top priority in the children's agenda this upcoming session. Groups like Family Forward and the Children's Institute have also signed on. So, it is certainly true that those sorts of additional resources that family, a credit like this would provide families, has all sorts of positive benefits. And one of those things that we've seen in research at the federal level is better educational attainment and better earnings typically for children and over the course of their lifetime. So yes, there's all sorts of positive social impacts from just getting families who are struggling some additional cash. And we are working closely with a number of organizations who are connected to the education world, connected to children's advocacy efforts. And so we're excited that the kids credit is seen as a priority amongst those organizations as well.
That's great. Thank you. The last question we have on the queue is from Venus Barnes, and this may be a sort of a tactical approach, but would it make a difference if instead of using income in the language of the bill, we use the word stipend?
Oh, this might be referring to the monthly payment issue. I think that's where the federal rules are unclear. I think what it would come down to is if it's still, regardless of what we call it, if it's still a benefit being delivered on a more regular than annual basis through the tax code, that's where the rules are unclear, and it may start to count as income when a family's being considered for eligibility for a housing voucher or SNAP or whatever it might be. So we really need to get that clarity at the federal level. I think that's like one of those risk areas where we don't want to have those unintended consequences of moving forward with a concept like that, and then find out as a result of some court ruling or something down the line that thousands of Oregon families are suddenly going to lose access to other benefits as a result of claiming this credit. So we want to be really careful with that. And that is, I'll just say too, that's something that some of our federal partners are really digging in more on, is figuring out, are there ways that states could start to push the envelope on this more regular payment piece of the equation, and see if that can kind of catalyze something at the federal level. So we work closely with an organization, for instance, called the Economic Security Project, I was just on a call with them this morning, and one of the things we were talking about as a group was, are there ways in which we could push to, maybe it's not monthly, but maybe it's quarterly? Is there enough gray area there where we could maybe push something there where we could catalyze an effort to clarify this once and for all at the federal level? So they have like a legal team working on that, kind of figuring out some opinions and developing some best practices for how to move forward that piece of the conversation. And that's something we're going to be really, in the loop on going forward. And I think if we get that clarity from them that like, hey, there is a path, one of the things we would want to come back for in the 24 session would be like, let's get that in the mix here. Like we know that getting resources to families in real time is really critical. And so, even if we're successful on the Oregon Kids Credit, making that an annual tax credit, we're not going to lose sight on that monthly or more regular than annual piece. And that's something we're going to be pushing for whenever the moment is right.
Let me just add one other thing with respect to the federal work that may be involved in this effort, whether this is in the short term or in the long term as we move to improve the policy once it begins to be implemented. And that is that I do feel that we have a number of champions in our congressional delegation, but pointing out particularly Senator Wyden, who's the chair of the Senate Finance Committee, and was incredibly supportive of our efforts to expand the federal child tax credit. This may involve also some advocacy work at a federal level, but know that we have some good friends and good places up there. Shifting to the last comment from Lori Palmer, asking us, she's founder of gogetyourchild.org. I hadn't heard from your organization. Thanks for joining us, Lori. They're working with families that are affected by gun violence. The way to partner with us, if you can reach out to any of us using the link, maybe we can go back to that slide, Tyler, in terms of how you can join. You can also find our contact information on our website. And if you want to reach out to Tyler directly, that's another way to get involved. So thank you. Thanks for joining us. And thanks everybody for your participation today. I want to take a moment again to thank you not only for being here today, but for your continued support over the years of our organization. We couldn't do this work without that support. And I would urge you and encourage you to continue that support, whether it's through financial gifts or by being engaged in this campaign. Really, it depends on all of us. And a reminder, by the way, that this bit.ly link, you need to use Oregon Kids Credit in non-caps. Otherwise, it will take you to a different spot. But again, thank you for your support, and we look forward to continue to work with you and continue to update you on the progress of this campaign. Thanks again, and we are concluding this event. Thank you for joining us.